April 11th, 1944. Anzio beachhead, Italy. A patrol from the 1st Special Service Force froze in place just 150 yards from German lines. Through the pre-dawn mist, something small, something mechanical, something impossible was crawling toward their position across the cratered mud. The American soldiers had seen Tiger tanks. They had faced Panther tanks. They had survived attacks from every piece of German armor the Wehrmacht possessed. But what they were watching now defied every assumption about how war machines worked. This thing was barely 4 feet long, maybe 1 foot tall, and it was moving on its own, with no driver, no crew, no visible means of control. Just a miniature tracked vehicle rolling steadily forward through no man's land like a mechanical beetle hunting for prey. Behind it, 3 thin wires trailed back toward the German positions, playing out from a spool mounted on the vehicle's rear. Inside its metal belly, 60 kilograms of high explosives waited for the signal to detonate. The Americans didn't know it yet, but they were witnessing the world's first widespread deployment of unmanned ground combat vehicles, what the Wehrmacht called the Leichter Ladungsträger Goliath, the light charge carrier. What would become known to Allied troops by a more ominous name, the Doodlebug, a remote-controlled bomb that represented warfare's future, arriving decades ahead of its time. What happened next would determine whether this American patrol survived the morning and whether a captured German secret weapon would reveal technology that seemed more like science fiction than battlefield reality. The story of how Nazi Germany developed the world's first operational remote-controlled demolition vehicle begins not with German engineering, but with French ingenuity and German opportunity. In late 1940, as Wehrmacht forces occupied France following their lightning conquest, German soldiers recovered an unusual prototype near the Seine River. The vehicle had been designed by Adolphe Caigres, a brilliant French automotive engineer who had pioneered tracked vehicle technology. Caigres's prototype was a small, remote-controlled tracked vehicle intended to carry explosives to enemy positions. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of sending soldiers forward to plant demolitions under fire, operators could guide an unmanned vehicle to the target from a safe distance. The Wehrmacht Ordnance Bureau immediately recognized the potential. They directed the Carl F.W. Borgward Automotive Company in Bremen, Germany, to reverse engineer Caigres's design and create a production version capable of carrying at least 50 kilograms of high explosives. Borgward was an interesting choice for this project. The company had built its reputation manufacturing small, efficient automobiles and had even produced miniature mail delivery vehicles. Now they would apply that expertise to creating a weapon that combined automotive engineering with remote control technology that barely existed in 1940. The engineering challenges were substantial. The vehicle needed to be small enough to present a difficult target, yet large enough to carry a meaningful explosive payload. It required tracks robust enough to traverse battlefield terrain, including trenches, shell craters, and obstacles, but light enough that the vehicle didn't become impossibly heavy. Most critically, it needed a control system that would allow operators to steer the vehicle remotely with enough precision to guide it to specific targets hundreds of meters away. Borgward's solution emerged in April 1942 when the first production models rolled out of their Bremen factory. The vehicle they designated Sonderkraftfahrzeug 302, Special Purpose Vehicle 302, was unlike anything that had ever reached mass production. The hull was fabricated from 16-gauge mild steel, providing minimal armor protection but keeping weight manageable. The entire vehicle measured just 4 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 1 foot tall. Empty weight was approximately 380 pounds. With its 60-kilogram explosive payload, total weight climbed to about 510 pounds. Power came from two 2.5-kilowatt Bosch electric motors, one for each track. This twin-motor configuration allowed for differential steering. By varying power to each motor independently, the vehicle could turn left or right, advance forward or reverse. Maximum speed was approximately 6 miles per hour on level ground, though rough terrain reduced this considerably. The vehicle's ground clearance of just 4.5 inches meant it struggled with obstacles larger than a few inches high. The control system was ingeniously simple for 1942 technology. A joystick control box connected to the Goliath via a 3-strand cable that could extend up to 650 meters, roughly 2,130 feet. The cable was stored on a large drum mounted in the vehicle's rear compartment. As the Goliath advanced, the cable played out behind it. 2 of the 3 cable strands controlled movement and steering through a relay system. The operator could make the vehicle go forward, turn left, turn right, or reverse by manipulating the joystick. The 3rd strand served one purpose only: detonation. When the operator closed that circuit, the explosive payload detonated instantly. The explosive itself was contained in the vehicle's front compartment. Early models carried 60 kilograms, approximately 132 pounds, of high explosive. This was enough to destroy a bunker, collapse a building, tear apart a tank, or eliminate an entire infantry squad caught in the open. The Goliath was designed as a single-use weapon. Once detonated, nothing remained but scattered metal fragments. German military planners envisioned multiple roles for this revolutionary weapon. It could destroy enemy tanks by crawling underneath and detonating against their thin belly armor. It could disrupt dense infantry formations by detonating in their midst. It could demolish bridges, bunkers, and fortified positions. It could clear minefields by detonating in the middle of them, triggering sympathetic detonations. Most intriguingly, it represented a weapon that could neutralize threats without risking the lives of German soldiers. Initial production of the SDKFZ-302 began in April 1942. These electrically powered versions would total approximately 2,600 units before production shifted to a new variant in late 1942. The problem with the electric motor version became apparent quickly: cost and complexity. Each electric motor Goliath cost 3,000 Reichsmarks to produce, an enormous sum when Germany needed to produce them in large quantities. The electric motors were also difficult to maintain in combat conditions and vulnerable to moisture damage. In late 1942, Borgward introduced the SDKFZ-303A, powered by a simple Zündap 2-cylinder gasoline engine. This variant was cheaper, simpler to maintain, and more reliable in field conditions. The trade-off was noise. Where the electric version ran almost silently, the gasoline engine puttered loudly, alerting enemy forces to its approach. Production of the gasoline-powered variant continued through the end of the war. A slightly larger 303B version, introduced in 1944, could carry a 100-kilogram payload, approximately 220 pounds of high explosive. By war's end, total Goliath production reached 7,564 units across all variants. German combat engineer companies and specialized panzer units received the vehicles starting in early 1942. They were deployed on every major front except North Africa, the Eastern Front against Soviet forces, Italy against American and British forces, France against Allied invasion forces, and even in occupied territories against resistance fighters. But the Goliath's baptism of fire would reveal serious limitations that German planners had not fully anticipated. The reality of combat exposed every weakness in the design. The first major Allied encounter with Goliath tracked mines occurred at Anzio, Italy, in January through April 1944. The Anzio operation, codenamed Operation Shingle, had placed 69,000 Allied troops on a 10-mile beachhead south of Rome. German forces surrounded the beachhead and subjected it to constant artillery bombardment, aerial attack, and infantry assaults. The Germans positioned Goliath units in small camouflaged bunkers around the beachhead perimeter, intending to use them against Allied vehicles, troop concentrations, and defensive positions. The American soldiers who first spotted these devices had no idea what they were looking at. Combat reports from soldiers at Anzio describe their confusion and alarm at seeing small tracked vehicles crawling toward their positions with no visible crew. Some troops initially thought they were seeing German remote-controlled tanks, miniature versions of the panzers they had been fighting. The reality was somehow more unsettling. These were not tanks at all, but mobile bombs designed for one purpose only: to reach American positions and explode. Naval bombardment from Allied warships offshore eliminated most of the Goliaths before they could be deployed effectively. Artillery shells severed their control cables, rendering them harmless, but some did reach their targets. At least one Goliath successfully engaged a vehicle from the 509 Parachute Infantry Battalion in the Maritime Alps, following the landings in southern France in August 1944. The explosion demonstrated the weapon's devastating potential when it actually reached its target, but far more often the Goliaths failed. Their vulnerable control cables proved to be a fatal design flaw. Any damage to the cable, from artillery, small arms fire, shrapnel, or even a soldier with wire cutters, severed the connection between operator and vehicle. Once disconnected, the Goliath became an immobile metal box filled with explosives. American soldiers quickly learned to watch for the trailing cables and target them specifically. A few rifle shots could neutralize the threat entirely. The vehicle's slow speed compounded the problem. At 6 miles per hour, maximum, and often much slower on rough terrain, the Goliath took considerable time to reach its target. This gave defenders ample opportunity to spot the approaching vehicle and respond. The distinctive sound of the gasoline-powered variants advertised their approach from hundreds of yards away. The electric versions were quieter, but suffered from limited range and frequent mechanical problems. Ground clearance was another critical limitation. At just 4.5 inches, the Goliath struggled with any obstacle larger than a small rock or shallow rut. Shell craters, which littered every active battlefield, often stopped the vehicles completely. Wire entanglements, designed to slow infantry advances, proved equally effective against the miniature tanks. Even rough terrain reduced their already slow speed to a crawl. The thin armor, just 16-gauge mild steel, offered no protection against any form of anti-tank weapon. Even rifle-caliber bullets could penetrate the hull and damage internal components or detonate the explosive payload prematurely. Machine gun fire could destroy a Goliath in seconds. The vehicles were essentially unarmored bombs, crawling slowly toward targets while connected by a vulnerable cable to operators who had to maintain line of sight. Despite these limitations, the psychological impact on Allied soldiers who encountered Goliaths for the first time was considerable. There was something deeply unsettling about watching an unmanned vehicle crawling toward your position with enough explosives to eliminate your entire squad. The technology seemed almost supernatural for 1944, like something from a distant future had appeared on the battlefield decades early. On April 11th, 1944, that first Special Service Force patrol discovered their Goliath just 150 yards from German positions. After watching it for several minutes to understand its behavior, they realized the control cable was its weakness. A few well-placed rifle shots severed the connection. The vehicle stopped immediately, rendered harmless. The Americans carefully approached, verified it was no longer operational, and carried it back to their lines on a hospital stretcher like a wounded soldier. What happened next reveals how American military intelligence operated. The captured Goliath was delivered to Sergeant Lester Sachs from Brooklyn, New York, an ordnance specialist with the 6th Corps. Sachs and his team carefully examined every aspect of the vehicle. They documented the electric motors, the control system, the explosive payload, and the relay mechanisms. They traced every wire, measured every component, and photographed the entire vehicle from multiple angles. The U.S. Army's Technical Intelligence Report on the captured Goliath, dated April 11, 1944, described it in detail. The report noted that contrary to popular belief among American troops, the vehicle was not radio-controlled. It used wire control through a cable paid out from the rear. The report detailed the battery system, the twin electric motors, the control wire configuration, and the steering mechanism. Most importantly, it identified the critical vulnerabilities: the fragile control cables, the weak armor, the limited range, and the slow speed. Allied troops encountered more Goliaths on D-Day, June 6, 1944. German defenders positioned the vehicles in bunkers along the Normandy beaches, intending to drive them into concentrations of landing craft and troops. But concentrated naval bombardment before the landings destroyed most of them. Artillery blasts severed their control cables before they could be deployed. The few that did activate were easily neutralized by infantry fire. One American combat engineer, Dennis Shryock, recalled his D-Day encounter with a Goliath vividly in later interviews. He was moving through the chaos of Omaha Beach, demolishing obstacles under intense fire, when he paused to watch one of the doodle bugs roll through the sand. The Germans were close enough that he could hear their voices. The small tracked vehicle moved like a remote-controlled toy, trailing its cables behind it. Shryock hesitated, transfixed by the strange sight, before snapping back to awareness and moving to cover. His moment of distraction nearly cost him his life, but he survived with only a chipped tooth from flying shrapnel. The Polish Home Army encountered Goliaths during the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, when German forces deployed them against resistance fighters in the city streets. The Polish resistance quickly discovered that cutting the control cables rendered the vehicles harmless. This tactic proved so effective that German attempts to use Goliaths in urban combat largely failed. The confined streets and abundance of cover made the slow-moving vehicles easy targets. Polish fighters could approach under cover, sever the cables, and neutralize the threat. Despite over 7,500 produced, the Goliath was never considered a successful weapon by either side. The German Army's own assessments acknowledged its limitations. Captured German maintenance manuals revealed additional problems. The control boxes were fragile and prone to damage. The electrical systems were vulnerable to moisture. The steering mechanisms required constant adjustment, and daily maintenance was essential just to keep the vehicles operational. The manuals even specified that practice driving with the Goliath was forbidden because the vehicles were too expensive and limited in number to waste on training. Allied soldiers who captured intact Goliaths found them fascinating for their novelty value rather than their military effectiveness. Photographs from 1944 show American and British soldiers playing with captured Goliaths like remote-controlled toys, the explosive charges removed. Some soldiers posed for pictures sitting on them or standing beside them. The vehicles became curiosities, examples of German ingenuity applied to a concept that was ahead of its time, but hampered by technology that wasn't quite ready for practical battlefield application. The unit cost relative to effectiveness made the Goliath economically inefficient. At 3,000 Reichsmarks for the electric version and somewhat less for the gasoline variant, each vehicle was expensive to produce. Given that they were single-use weapons destroyed upon detonation, and given their low success rate in actually reaching targets, the return on investment was poor. Germany's industrial resources in the later war years were increasingly strained. Producing over 7,000 Goliaths consumed materials and manufacturing capacity that might have been better allocated to conventional weapons with proven effectiveness. Yet, for all its failures, the Goliath tracked mine represents a significant milestone in military technology. It was the world's first mass-produced unmanned ground vehicle designed specifically for combat operations. It pioneered concepts that would not see practical realization until decades later: remote-controlled robots, unmanned demolition vehicles, and disposable precision strike weapons. Modern military forces use unmanned ground vehicles for bomb disposal, reconnaissance, and even offensive operations. These contemporary systems benefit from wireless radio control, advanced optics and sensors, GPS navigation, and robust construction, all technologies unavailable in 1944. But the fundamental concept, a remotely operated vehicle that can approach dangerous targets without risking operator lives, traces directly back to Adolphe Quegres's French prototype and the German Goliath that followed. The irony is that current conflicts have seen the resurrection of the Goliath concept in a form remarkably similar to the original. In Ukraine and other modern battlefields, both sides have deployed small remote-controlled ground vehicles carrying explosives. These contemporary versions use video cameras for guidance, electric motors for quiet operation, and wireless control to eliminate the vulnerable cable problem. They move faster, carry more explosives, and succeed more often than their World War II ancestor. But they are fundamentally the same idea: a mobile bomb guided to its target by an operator at a safe distance. For the American soldiers at Anzio, who first captured a Goliath in April 1944, the strange little vehicle represented something unexpected on the battlefield. After months of fighting conventional German forces with conventional weapons, they suddenly encountered a piece of technology that seemed futuristic: a tank with no crew, a bomb that drove itself, a weapon controlled by invisible signals through a cable. It was unsettling, fascinating, and ultimately not as threatening as it appeared. Sergeant Lester Sachs, examining that first captured Goliath in the Anzio beachhead, could not have known he was documenting a weapon system that would influence military technology for generations. The photographs he took, the measurements he recorded, and the technical assessment he helped compile would be studied by American engineers and tacticians long after the war ended. Some of those insights would inform post-war American development of unmanned systems. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, large numbers of Goliaths had been captured by advancing Allied forces. They were found abandoned in bunkers, stored in warehouses, and left behind during German retreats. Some were shipped back to the United States and Britain for detailed technical evaluation. Engineers studied their control systems, examined their construction, and analyzed their tactical employment. The consensus was that while the concept had merit, the execution was premature. The technology of 1944 simply wasn't advanced enough to make remote-controlled vehicles practical for battlefield use. The German soldiers who operated Goliaths in combat had mixed feelings about the weapon. Some appreciated that it allowed them to attack enemy positions without exposing themselves to direct fire. Others were frustrated by the vehicle's frequent mechanical failures, vulnerability to countermeasures, and limited effectiveness. Operators had to remain relatively close to maintain line of sight and cable connection, often exposing themselves to the same dangers they were trying to avoid. The soldiers who designed and built the Goliaths at Borgward's Bremen factory could not have anticipated how their work would be remembered. They were solving immediate engineering problems: how to create a small, tracked vehicle, how to make it steerable via cable control, how to package enough explosives to be militarily useful. They succeeded in creating a functional weapon that saw deployment on multiple fronts, but they also created a system whose limitations doomed it to marginal effectiveness. What the Goliath really represents is the gap between concept and execution, between innovative ideas and practical implementation. The Germans recognized that unmanned weapons could provide tactical advantages. They understood that remote operation could save lives and allow attacks that would otherwise be impossible. They correctly anticipated concepts that would become dominant in 21st century warfare. But they were working with 1940s technology: wire control instead of radio, mechanical relays instead of electronics, primitive electric motors and gasoline engines instead of modern power systems. Still, over 7,500 Goliaths were built and deployed. Some reached their targets and detonated successfully, achieving their mission of destroying enemy equipment and positions. Most did not, falling victim to the inherent limitations of their design. But every Goliath that crawled toward Allied lines represented German willingness to innovate, to try unconventional approaches, to develop weapons that seemed like science fiction made real. For the American soldiers who encountered them, captured them, and eventually understood them, Goliaths became one of many strange German innovations that characterized the later years of World War II. Alongside jet fighters, rocket-powered interceptors, guided anti-ship missiles, and ballistic rockets, the Goliath represented Germany's attempts to achieve through technology what they could no longer achieve through conventional military means. The miniature tank that shocked American troops at Anzio in April 1944 was both more and less than it appeared. More in the sense that it represented genuinely innovative thinking about unmanned warfare decades ahead of its time. Less in the sense that its practical effectiveness was limited by technological constraints that would not be overcome for many decades. It was a weapon from the future that arrived too early, built with tools from the past. And in that tension between aspiration and capability lies the story of the Goliath, a remote-controlled bomb that crawled slowly through the mud of World War II battlefields, trailing cables behind it, more effective as a harbinger of things to come than as a weapon of its own time. When modern soldiers deploy unmanned ground vehicles in contemporary conflicts, they are using descendants of that strange device American troops first captured 75 years ago. The technology has evolved dramatically, but the core concept remains: remove the human from immediate danger by letting a machine approach the target instead. In that sense, those German engineers at Borgward in 1942 succeeded in their vision even if their specific implementation fell short. They proved the concept could work, even if it would take another half-century of technological advancement to make it work well. The American soldiers at Anzio, who carried that captured Goliath back on a stretcher, who examined it with fascination and confusion, who photographed and documented every detail, they were witnessing the awkward birth of a weapon concept that would eventually transform warfare. They just didn't know it yet. To them, it was simply one more strange German device in a war full of unexpected innovations. But history would remember the Goliath as something more, the first step on a long technological journey toward the unmanned systems that now dominate modern military operations. And it all began with a small tracked vehicle barely 4 feet long, crawling through the Italian mud toward American positions at dawn, controlled by invisible signals through a cable, carrying enough explosives to change everything. If only it could reach its target before someone cut the wire. And that's the end of today's story. If you were amazed by the Goliath, this tiny tank that crawled through the mud and changed the future of warfare, make sure to subscribe for more unbelievable stories from World War II. Hit the like button and tell us in the comments which forgotten weapon or battle you'd like to see next. Don't let history pass you by. Join us for the next mission.